Yeah, and I think
so once again, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm really thrilled that we are, I'm welcoming you to our 12th, and actually not as thrilled that it's the final webinar, but I'm so excited that I know a lot of you have been with us for the last 11 webinars live, and we are really enjoy having you with us for our final webinar of the series. So this is the final, as I said, webinar of the 2021 Landscaping with Virginia Natives webinar series. And my name is Virginia Whitmer, and I'm with the Virginia Coastal Zone Management Program. And tonight we are pleased to welcome Carol Heiser, who's going to wrap up our series with a presentation on how native plants are the backbone of a healthy conservation landscape. The webinar series has been brought to you by the Plant Virginia Natives Marketing Partnership. This is a collaborative and a statewide initiative to increase the use and to drive an increase in the availability of Virginia's natives for their there's a beautiful variety, and they have numerous ecological, economic, and aesthetic benefits. The Virginia Coastal Zone Management Program, also known as Virginia CZM, initiated and has been coordinating the partnership through grants from NOAA since the first regional marketing campaign on Virginia's Eastern Shore was launched over a decade ago. Pardon me. So Plant Virginia Natives now engages and connects hundreds of local, regional, and state partners. And I want to call out some key staff in some of these partner organizations for their role in making tonight's webinar possible. Our Zoom host, Lewis Skinner Botanical Garden, is also a partner in the Plant RVA Natives campaign. And I especially want to thank Phyllis Laslett and Megan Compton. Megan has handled registration for our I think just over 3,100 plus attendees. So that's just fantastic. And that help has been very much appreciated. Our MC tonight will be Margaret Fisher with the Plant Nova Natives campaign. Our Q&A lead is Beth Mizell with the Blue Ridge Prism and the Plant Northern Piedmont Natives campaign. Actually, Beth is the coordinator of that campaign. And helping Beth behind the scenes and helping Carol, our speaker, respond to as many of your questions as is possible tonight will be Joanne Hutton with the Plant Nova Natives campaign. And Joanne's also a master naturalist and master gardener. Emily Byers with the Virginia Native Plant Society. Stacy Moles with VDOT and also the Plant RVA Natives campaign. And Anna Maria Johnson with James Madison University. And Anna Maria is also a master naturalist. And I also want to say thanks to the many Plant Virginia Natives partners who helped to plan this event and this series. And finally, I want to thank you, our audience. Without you, the audience, this series would not happen. And there's a little housekeeping we also need to keep in mind. And so I will turn this over now to Phyllis.
Good evening and welcome. We're looking forward to having you with us tonight. For those of you who have hung in with us for all 12 sessions, sort of a bittersweet night. It's been great fun, and thank you for coming. I'm the Adult Education Manager at Lewis Skinner Botanical Garden. For those who are new to Zoom webinars, and as a refresher for our returning participants, we wanted to give you a few housekeeping tips about Zoom. In a webinar, it's different from a meeting. Your audio and video are muted. We'll walk you through how to use the toolbar to communicate. There are a lot of you in this webinar. Right now, we're right at 500. So we're asking everyone to use the Q&A function to ask questions. It's easier to keep track of that way. If you would take a look at the Zoom toolbar, And to find it, you hover your cursor over the Zoom window or click on the menu bar if you're on a smartphone. So on the toolbar from the left, you'll see the Q&A icon. Click this to ask questions in the Q&A. This will be your primary communication. Please note that when a question is to be answered live, that means it will be addressed in the break and not in the moment. We're not happy with the Zoom language, but that's what it means for us. Next, you'll see the chat button, which you were using to tell us about where you're planting natives. The chat is disabled during the webinar because it's harder to keep track of questions there. Your hosts can still use the chat to communicate with you, but you will not be able to use it. Using Q&A enables us to keep track of which questions have been answered. So the hosts and panelists may use the chat to update you or clarify closed captioning. Take note of the raise hand button as well. This has also been turned off, again, because there are so many of you that we can't keep track with that function. And finally, we have enabled the closed captioning function in Zoom. If you need this aid, click on the CC icon and select subtitles. It's pretty good, but we will clarify as needed in the chat because the service does not recognize botanical names. We tried. If you are using a PC, you can turn this function off, but it cannot be turned off for mobile devices like smartphones or tablets. We're sorry about that, but there are many people who do need this service. We will end tonight's program promptly at 8:15 p.m. As a reminder, we are recording the session and we'll send a link to the recording in the week following the event. After we wrap up the end of the webinar series, all available recordings will be posted to the Plant Virginia Natives website. Thank you, and over to Margaret.
Thanks, Phyllis. Well, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker tonight. Carol Heiser is a certified level 1 Chesapeake Bay landscape professional who serves on its steering committee and on the board of the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council. She's also a member of the advisory committee of Audubon at Home for the Audubon Society of Northern Virginia. Carol retired in 2020 with over 31 years in state service, with 27 of them at the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources as Habitat Education Coordinator and Education Section Manager. Her decades of experience include conservation program and event planning, volunteer training, and implementation of numerous habitat demonstration projects. She wrote dozens of articles published in Virginia Wildlife Magazine and has many other writings to her credit, including Chapter 13 of the Virginia Master Gardener Handbook, Habitat Gardening for Wildlife. She has a BS in Forestry and Wildlife from Virginia Tech and a Certificate of Landscape Design from George Washington University. So without further ado, I turn this over to Carol.
Well, thank you very much, Margaret. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right, let me see if I can share my screen. All right, are you able to see that all right?
You see it perfectly.
Great. And I'm going to have to collapse you all because I can't. All right, there we go. Well, thank you all very much. So nice to be here this evening. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm honored to be here to support the Plant Virginia Natives, Virginia Native Plant Marketing Partnership. It's been a long time coming, and I'm just so excited that there are so many of you who are interested in this topic. And I'm just, my heart is full because I'm just excited that so many people are interested in doing the right thing for the land. I'm coming to you, speaking of the land, I'm coming to you from Central Virginia, which is the ancestral home of the Monacan Nation, who were the first peoples to care for this land and who are still here in Virginia. And for those of you who may have attended the whole series, this past webinar series, maybe some of what I cover tonight will be a review. And for those of you who might have missed a talk or maybe didn't get to see any of them, I'm hoping that some of the information I share with you tonight will feel new and fresh. And if not, maybe it'll just be a reminder and a validation of something that you're already doing and are doing well. All right, so it's not advancing. Okay. It's not letting me go to the next slide.
Carol, perhaps just click on your monitor in another location, and then you'll be able to advance.
Yeah, I tried the arrow and I tried the inner, it worked before. Let's see. That's strange. Maybe I should stop share and reshare because it's not responding. Let's try that. Let's start over. I think I'll just do it. Well, let's try it this way one more time. Okay. Okay. Well, for some reason it's not. Oh, there it is. Finally. Yay. All right. So to get us started, I want you to just very briefly, don't fall asleep on me now, very briefly close your eyes and imagine, think of a beautiful place on planet Earth, some place that you've been in nature before. It can be anywhere in the whole world, a place where you felt safe and secure and enveloped by beauty and green, a place in nature that speaks to your spirit and makes you feel whole. And just hold on to that in your heart for the rest of our talk, and then we'll revisit that again at the very end. But I want you to just sort of grab hold of a nice memory in nature, and we'll go from there. So this is all really based on nature. That's what conservation is about. Conservation is about the wise use of our natural resources, not necessarily just setting things aside for preservation, though there is much value in doing that. But ecosystems and ecosystem function is really what conservation landscaping is based on. And ecosystems, of course, are functional systems. They are places where energy is exchanged from plant communities to animal communities and back again. There's all these different cycles and processes that take place in an ecosystem system. There are many different functions that ecosystems provide for us. They provide us with clean air to breathe. They provide us with plants to eat. They provide us with fruits. They provide so many services in the landscape that there are just so many to go over. But the most important part about ecosystems is that they're all interrelated and they're all functional because of all these different interrelationships and how all of these plant and animal communities have co-evolved together. And they're made up of the biotic parts, the parts that are living, all the living organisms on the earth, as well as the non-living components like the soils, the sunlight, and water. And together those two form those ecosystems, and all life depends on those different systems. So when we talk about diversity of systems or the diversity of life or biodiversity, we're talking about all of those genes, species, systems in the aggregate across the whole landscape. And when you think of all of these as multifunctional systems and huge food webs, you realize that no one thing in isolation really can be effective or functional. Everything depends on everything else. And so when we look at a natural system, even if it's a system such as this one that has been harvested at one point, because you can see the trees are at different heights in this landscape, there's still many things that are going on here that we may not really notice right up front, but we're going to be talking about all these different pieces and parts throughout the presentation this evening. But the principle, I think, that really knits all of this together is that where you have the most diverse systems is where you have the most stability in the landscape. And where things break down is when you start moving or taking things out of those systems and changing the function, then that has a ripple effect and sometimes a negative cascading effect through multiple systems. So if we can sustain diversity or replace or increase diversity in our landscapes, whether they're big or small landscapes, then we will be contributing to the stability of those systems and their health ultimately in the long run. So that really is the foundation of conservation. Again, we're trying to conserve what we have, make the best use of it so that we can enjoy it, but that we can also make sure that we're sustaining other life around us. Because frankly, we're sharing this planet with all these other creatures. We might like to think of ourselves as separate from nature, but we are part of nature and nature is part of us. And without nature, we really cannot survive, even though we think all of our inventions might get us there. Well, they might at some point, but for now, we are part of these systems, and our diversity and our ability to survive is really based on the functions of these systems. So the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council is a regional group, and that's really where this information, the conservation landscaping guiding principles, come from. And I hope you will check out this organization to try to join it, because there are many multiple benefits of joining the organization and being part of a huge network of organizations and individuals who are dedicated to trying to support and sustain the health of the Chesapeake Bay through all of these landscape best management practices. The CCLC is regional through the Bay watershed, but certainly much of the information that they're sharing can be used in other parts of the country, actually. So some of you may be calling in from other states to view this presentation, and that's fine. This information is really available to anybody who's interested in conservation landscaping. So before I forget, I wanted to make sure I mentioned to you that, as it happens every other year, they have a conference, and there is a conference coming up in December 8th and 9th. There's 2 days that are going to be online, and then the third day is field trips of your choice, whether you want to participate in Virginia, Maryland, or Pennsylvania. And so that's their website. The conference is excellent, and it's not just for professionals, although it's geared towards contractors, landscapers, designers, installers, maintainers, but also for educators and other folks who are really interested in engaging with conservation landscaping professionals and others who are interested in these topics. And if you go to that website, and if you do join, one of the benefits of joining actually is that you'll be able to participate in free sustainability webinars. They have a whole series of wonderful webinars that you can access that are being provided through CCLC in cooperation with the Ecological Landscaping Alliance and other organizations. And there are just many benefits of being a member. So I hope you will consider joining. The conservation landscaping guidelines that I'm going to be covering are called the 8 essential elements. And there's probably 10 or 12 or 15 other elements that we could add. You could spend a lot of time talking about all the best practices that you can use in a landscape. But CCLC has coined the 8 essential elements of conservation landscaping, and I'm going to cover them with you now this evening. Just know that the order that I put them in my presentation is in the order the way my brain works, and they're not exactly in the order that they are in the book, but they're all in there. So the first one is really just that we're designing this landscape in a way that will benefit the environment, so that it will function efficiently and aesthetically. And the function, again, really speaks to that whole idea of ecosystem function and knowing that the landscape around us is a living, dynamic system where there are many interrelationships and things that are going on that is really needed for the health of that landscape to survive. And whether or not we have a very small lot, such as this landscape in front of a house that's in one of the, a typical subdivision, you'll see that there are some principles there. Just immediately off the top of my head, I can see that there's ground covers, there's layers of vegetation, there's flowering plants. There's an ethic here. There's a way of sustaining a landscape so that others, could do the same and even model these for folks in your neighborhood. And in some places, there are places that have tried to restore areas, whether this is, a school, or in this case, this is an office park, an office building. This was the Fish and Wildlife Service headquarters, actually, in Annapolis many years ago, when they implemented a conservation landscape around their building. And they basically just put in these plants to try to show that they can be very attractive and very aesthetic and designed in a way that are pleasing to the eye, but that are also full of life and will not only bring the life back, but keep the life there in a system that's functioning. So the primary care when you're trying to create one of these landscapes, or looking at it from a big picture point of view, is trying to begin by preserving as many natural features that are there on the landscape as you can, and being realistic about what your landscape can sustain. Looking at the slope, at the runoff, at the amount of water it gets. Is it dry? Is it wet? You know, a lot of gardening is based on these principles too. It's like knowing your site and making sure you're paying attention to the conditions of your site to make sure that things will grow there and grow there adequately. But creating habitat and creating planted areas that treat or minimize the amount of runoff is really important. And the maintenance piece can be tricky, because sometimes folks get in a little over their heads and they'll start planting a bunch of things and not realizing how difficult some plants might be to maintain. Or they might think, oh, well, this actually isn't so hard, I can do more of this. But trying to strive for low maintenance is a good goal. And by that, I mean, low maintenance for me means not mowing as often, not needing to weed as often, leaving dead plants standing in the wintertime, not going in and, you know, ripping out pansies and then planting something else, begonias, and then ripping out the begonias and planting the pansies again. To me, that seems like a lot of extra work that's unnecessary when you could be using perennials that are much less of a maintenance headache in the long run. In the short run, getting them established might take some maintenance, but getting them established and then having them established over time, they can be quite low maintenance. And basically the ethic is designed to try to mimic or mirror patterns that are found in nature, whether that be assemblages of plants and choices that you make of what plants to choose and put in your landscape, or the patterns of layering and growth and how things typically grow and migrate and move around in the landscape, being attentive to that and being open to that and allowing that to transform and unfold in your landscape. And as you can probably see from these two photographs, decreasing the amount of lawn we have is really one of the primary objectives of conservation landscaping, because lawn does not support very much life. It's rather not diverse at all. And it also has a fairly high runoff coefficient. Even though it is a plant, it's not concrete, it still has a fairly high coefficient, which just means that water will run off a lot faster on turf grass than it does from a perennial planted bed. So that's the first one. Is the big picture is designing for it to be aesthetic and functional. And I like to start with the soils. So the second one is just being very mindful of the kind of soils that you have on the property, whether it's clay or loam or sand. And what does it take to promote healthy soil? How do you keep those soils enriched? Leaving the leaves on the ground is a really important one. Keeping the ground covered and not letting it run off is important too. But soil is going to be the backbone of anything that you grow in your property or your community. So if you don't really have very good soils, because they haven't been replenished with organic matter from the natural vegetation that's around it, then your soils are going to be very marginal and they're not going to support much life. And the plants that do grow there won't be very healthy and won't succeed as well. So one of the things that we try to strive for in a conservation landscape, after you've gotten obviously your beds and things planted and established, is really to avoid disturbing the soil as much as possible. Every time you displace the soil, you run the risk of runoff. But not only that, disturbing the soil also opens it up to more incursions by non-native invasive plants. And just general weeds, in general, just disturbing the soil brings weed seeds up to the surface and can actually create more work for yourself each time you rip things out and pull things out. If you're a gardener and you're trying to get rid of weeds, consider cutting off the tops of some of the weedy plants, not letting them go to seed rather than ripping them out of the ground every time, because each time you pull up a clump of weeds, you're disturbing the soil. If the soil is compacted, I think a lot of people think, well, I'll just get in there with a big, ripper and tear it all up and try to break it up and let some air down into it. Well, that's the short-term method, but sometimes that ends up breaking up the soil structure even more and causing more problems. Whereas if you were to enrich the soil by putting back the pine needles or the leaves that fall in the landscape, or adding material back to the ground that can gradually decompose and put more organics and add more structure and air spaces back into the soil. That would be one way of making it not so compacted anymore over time. It doesn't really take that long. It takes like 2 or 3 years to restore soil if you stop taking away the leaves and just allow the leaves to stay on the ground and gradually decompose and re-enrich and replenish that soil. And the same kind of the converse of that is at the same time limiting the use of fertilizers and chemicals that you put on the ground in the soil, because sometimes those fertilizers have a tendency to create like these crystals underneath the soil, where you end up with particles of all these different nutrients that have been leached out. And it's just like this whole process that takes place, an unnatural process that can actually work to your disadvantage in the future. You're better off not using fertilizers if possible, and just using the organics to keep the systems functioning and healthy. So those are some ways of maintaining healthy soils. Another key component, and I'm sure that's why most of you came to the talk tonight, because it's a native plant series, is conservation landscapes rely on using locally, if possible, native plants are appropriate for lichens. And locally can be kind of subjective. If you can source native plants that are down the street from you in a neighborhood cul-de-sac in your community common area, sure, collect those seeds locally and use them in your own garden. The closer you are in getting plants that come from your neighborhood, the better. And then as you move further out and away from your area, you're running into genetics from different areas, different regions, which can change some things in your environment. But we try to strive for locally native plants as much as possible. And really, in case you're wondering, or sometimes people ask, well, what does that really mean? What does it mean to be native? These are plants that have occurred here over evolutionary time and in geologic time. They've co-evolved with the different processes of physical changes that are characteristic in the region, whether that's the climate or the types of soils that arose, the amount of rainfall, the drought, the frost. All of those conditions that we were talking about earlier, the abiotic conditions in the landscape have impacted and have influenced how plants have co-evolved, as well as with other species in the local community. And that means other insects and organisms, including mammals and birds and things like that. So all these interrelationships are really the result of long time of adaptation, and native species are those that have adapted to the area and are best adapted actually for the area, as opposed to something that you would bring in an ornamental that comes from Europe or Asia that has evolved in its own area instead. And there's no better person or information that I know of that really describes these plant and insects interrelationships better than Dr. Doug Tallamy. Some of you may have seen his talk. I think it was at the very beginning of this series, an excellent presentation. And he has several books to his credit now. He started with the one called Bringing Nature Home, which has been updated and revised a few times. And Nature's Best Hope, he talks about, he sort of keeps going along that line with conservation. He did a book with Rick Dark on the living landscape, where they partnered on looking at, how do you design spaces that are very attractive, but that still have an eye towards those natural communities and trying to sustain life. So if you're really interested in landscape design and how to implement nature in a way that's very design aesthetic, take a look at The Living Landscape that he co-authored with Rick Dark. And his more recent book is The Nature of Oaks, all about ecology and how important the oak trees are. You could do a whole nother talk on that, and I'm sure he has actually. His ethic, his idea, his grand idea, his big picture idea is, if everybody converted at least half of their lawn all across America into a naturalistic landscape, or that included native plants and more shrubs and trees, you just did away with about half of your lawn, then they would get to their goal of 20 million acres of natural landscapes that would sustain a lot more life. And so he calls that, his initiative is called Homegrown National Park. If we all just do our part and start a new habit, the habit is in habitat, then we can really bring nature home and keep nature at home and learn to coexist with it. His first research, it's been almost 10 years ago now, bringing nature home. He started out by looking at landscapes that either had a predominance of native plants in the landscape or non-native plants. And he was really looking at the shrub layer. And so a typical landscape that he studied could be something like this, where you've got, your Bradford pears or Callery pears, you've got your burning bush, and you've got a few other ornamental plants. They're all ornamentation, basically. The Burford hollies and some of these different species in here may or may not be native to this landscape, and they pretty much come from different parts of the world. So a lot of our ornamentals that we purchase when we go to a nursery are plants that really did not come from this continent, many of them. They came from Asia or Europe. Maybe the spruce tree, okay, that comes from North America, it came from the Rockies, but it's not from the mid-Atlantic. It certainly, doesn't occur here in the mid-Atlantic in a natural way. So he looked at all these landscapes, and he compared the amount of, specifically, he looked at lepidopterans, which are the butterflies and the moths. And he looked to see what caterpillars were eating the leaves of these plants, to see if these non-native plants were actually supporting any life, if any caterpillars were using them. And just as one example, he had many examples in his book. You can read more about it in Bringing Nature Home. But one example is the Kusa dogwood, which is an Asian species. This is the one that blooms late in the year in June, and it has like really big flowers. It's not the native one, not the one that's native to Virginia. He found one species of Lepidopteran caterpillar that was using this species, whereas compared to something like flowering dogwood, Cornus florida, 117 species of butterfly and moth caterpillars were actively feeding on these leaves. And that's not it's not beetles and other insects, that's just caterpillars. And so he looked at the biomass, the amount of organic matter that all of these caterpillars are supporting, and the number of species. And he did find that had a predominance of non-native shrubs, there was much less biodiversity than there were in those areas that had a predominance of native shrubs in the landscape. And this is what he continues to do this research, and others are doing research on this as well, basically to make the case for how the more non-native ornamentals we have in our landscape, actually the less life we're supporting. And, maybe 200 years ago, that wasn't a big deal because there weren't as many of us, but now that there's millions of us in the country, and everybody's planting lawn and cutting down trees and cleaning up ditches, there's just a lot less diversity out there. And that in turn, unwittingly actually, is impacting bird species. So we know that habitat loss is really huge. We know that, in fact, it was in the journal Science, was back in 2019. They did a paper estimating that the bird population in US and Canada has declined almost 30% in the last 50 years. That's 3 billion fewer birds. And a lot of that is attributable to loss of habitat, which many of us may think that means, oh, somebody is clearing trees for a shopping center. Well, that's true. It could be that. And it could be, paving and development. So there's a lot of habitat that is being lost to that. But I think Talamy would also argue or say that habitat is also being lost just by using ornamental plants that aren't native to this area. As you may as well be planting plastic, basically. So plants are really huge in supporting wildlife species, and in particular, you look at songbirds in particular, 98% of them, songbirds feed their young insects. So baby birds, they don't eat seeds, they don't eat berries. Baby birds need protein, just like human babies. And the parent birds are, stuffing little bugs and caterpillars down their throats. And caterpillars are nice and soft and squishy, and it's easy for them to eat. And so, they're feeding their young tons and tons of these caterpillars and other small insects. And almost 40% of all animals on Earth are insects that eat plants. And 90% of those really rely on 3 or fewer plant families or genuses, genera, as host plants. So all of these insects, whether they're caterpillars or other types of insects, they are all pretty much keyed in on specific host plants that they need to survive. And if those plants aren't there, the insects aren't there. If the insects aren't there in the abundance that they could be, then the abundance of the birds goes down accordingly. So everything is hooked together. And, as we decrease the amount of diversity in our landscapes by planting monocultures of lawn with very, very much, lots of non-native plants that really aren't supporting anything, that's also a form of habitat loss, even though it might look like a good habitat. So when we talk about native plants, we're really talking about where they occur in a natural setting, in their natural range. And this has to do, again, with that evolutionary process over millennia of how they adapted to the geology and to the climate and the drought and rainfall amounts, that kind of thing. So, like this particular map, who knows what this is? This is a range map of a tree, let's say. So does it occur in Virginia? Well, sure it does. It occurs in the mountains of Virginia, but you can see the range map of this species is really more of an upper northeast and upper middle northern part of the continent. It's really a northern species, and it clearly likes higher elevations. So it's not to say it doesn't occur in Virginia, but it's here, but its range, expands beyond Virginia. So when you're looking at range maps, just kind of remember that, Virginia isn't like this little island in a vacuum, that there's lots of states around us, and plants occur in areas around us as well, but the range may be north of us or maybe south of us or further west. So that interdependence, I think, is the part that I just want to hit home, is that each of the species that we have in our landscape isn't really there in a vacuum. It's really part of a larger community. And if you can select plants to your local region, as we talked about earlier, if it's in your neighborhood, that's great. If a neighbor of yours down the street or across the county has some little trees growing in their yard, get one of those trees instead of buying it from a nursery that got it from somewhere up in Pennsylvania or down in Florida. Try to get plants that came from your local area. And if you can, try to stay within no more than 200 miles away and closer if possible. It's difficult, but the Native Plant Society and Plant Virginia Natives does have lists on their websites for where you can go to buy native plants in Virginia that are local. And this last bullet here about choosing straight species rather than cultivars, really it has to do with the ecology of plants and, again, those ecosystem services that they're providing. So, when plants co-evolved with insects, the plants developed practices or chemicals in their tissues to try to repel insects from eating them. And insects in turn evolved with them to try to overcome those systems. And so insects are specifically adapted to particular plants, and that could be because of the leaves, could be the type of leaf color, or could be the flower morphology, the shape of the flower or the color of the flower. So we want to avoid hybrids and cultivars, mainly because we want to select them because they might vary significantly from the wild type. And that's really key, because a cultivar, the word cultivar comes from the word cultivate, is where they take an attribute or a characteristic of a plant. Like, oh, I really like this really bushy flower. I'm going to try to make more of that. And then they select for that particular attribute. But in so doing, might be unwittingly changing the dynamic between the plant and the insect that relies on that plant. So in general, we ask that you exercise caution in selecting cultivars. Sometimes you have to have a really short plant in the landscape. Like there's, Joe Pye weeds, you can get a really short one, the little Joe short. And so we make allowances for that, not saying never use cultivars, but in general, if you can stick to the straight species, from an ecological standpoint, that is always going to be the best option because that's what nature adapted and co-evolved to live with. So from a big picture looking down, if you're going to be designing a big landscape and you really want to do it right, and by right, I mean using nature as your guide, then you're going to want to know what is the natural plant community of my area. And so this particular document that was put together by Department of Conservation and Recreation has all of the natural plant communities in Virginia, and they're arranged by ecological type. So for example, here in Central Virginia, we are in the Piedmont Oak Forest Complex. And if you go in this guide to that page where the Piedmont Oak Forest is, you can click on a code and it'll take you to a page that lists all of the native plants that or natural plant community that would be found occurring together in that oak, hickory, or whatever oak complex. And it'll list all of the trees, all the shrubs, all the perennials, the grasses, everything that would occur in that community would be listed here as defined by type. And so if you really want to be a purist, as some people do, there's nothing wrong with that, then use the natural communities as your reference for your site. What would actually be growing here if there wasn't a house here, if there wasn't a neighborhood, if I just let nature take its course, what would want to grow here? What kind of community would be growing here? What kinds of plants could I put back into this landscape that would occur here naturally? So we call that ecosystem modeling, where you're modeling your landscape after the actual natural ecosystem that would be found there. So that's one approach, and I highly recommend that if you really want to take the high road. There's many other ways, though, of selecting native plants that would be appropriate for your landscape. A lot of this work has already been done for you, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. One of my favorite references here, I've listed at least three. The first one is the Fish and Wildlife Service native plants for wildlife habitat and conservation landscaping. And it's based on the Bay watershed. So these are plants in this book, or at the Native Plant Center. You can get the you can go there directly, nativeplantcenter.net, and search for plants that way too. But just know that these are plants that occur all throughout that Chesapeake Bay watershed. So it might be a plant that could be found in Virginia as well as in New York or Pennsylvania. So that's kind of like big picture. Another way of finding native plants appropriate for your area is to look at the National Wildlife Federation website. They have a native plant finder, and you can type in your zip code at that website and it'll tell you, oh, here's what would probably be occurring in your area. And that's another way of getting a list. There's lots of lists out there. You're probably going to go bonkers thinking like, oh my gosh, there's all these, like, how do I even decide which plants to pick? Like that's a whole nother talk, but we'll get to a little piece of that in a second here. And then the third one here, to put another plug back in for Plant Virginia Natives, there have been tons and tons of volunteers, and volunteer hours have been put into regional native plant guides, where they've already done all the look. They've looked through lists after list after list. They've looked at range maps. They've narrowed it down to plants that would actually be fairly easy to grow in your area and that are actually probably accessible in most cases from native plant centers, where you can go to a nursery and actually find them and buy them. So if you look at the plantvirginianatives.org website, they're up to like 9 different guides now. They start on the Eastern Shore. There's one for the Richmond area. There's Central Rappahannock. There's Northern Piedmont, Southern Piedmont. Southwest Virginia is starting to work on one, or have already finished one. I can't remember. It's just fantastic that the state is gradually being covered by these regional guides. So if you want to start small, just pick up one of those books or download it and just pick out some plants from that as well. What I do as one other source, I really want to make sure that you're aware of, because those regional guides I was just telling you about, they're based on the digital, the Flora of Virginia, which is this huge 6-pound book that was put together. I think it was published already almost 10 years ago now, that contains, all of the species that are found in Virginia, not just natives, but anything pretty much. And they put it all in an app. So if you want to save yourself, you can download the app. So when you're offline somewhere out in the field and you want to identify a plant, you could use that to help you identify a species. But the plant atlas is where I go to. If somebody asks me randomly, well, can I plant Coreopsis here? What about Coreopsis? Or I'm like, well, I don't know. I would have to look here and see where does it occur in the state, because they might live in Harrisonburg or down in Virginia Beach. And I don't remember which Coreopsis grows best in Virginia Beach or Harrisonburg. So you enter the plant name on the website and it will give you range maps. Or you can also click on place there by county. You can click on county in the top toolbar there, and it'll give you a list of all the native plants in your county. I'm sorry, all the plants in your county, not necessarily native or not. But this is how I figure out what plants are native or not. And the reason I know that is because they have this little color key. A red dot means that the plant is native. A blue dot would be introduced. And a gray dot would be, we're not really sure. We think it's introduced, but we're not really positive of the status of the species. And I wanted to show you just these couple of examples of evergreens, because people always ask, well, what kind of evergreens would go good? A friend of yours might say, oh, put in a huge, rose bay, rhododendron. They're great. They get humongous. It's like a little tree. I love it so much. But if you look down there where it says number 4, the great rhododendron maximum, that's really a higher elevation plant. It grows mostly in the Blue Ridge and the Valley and the Appalachians further west in the state. It doesn't really grow in the coastal plain. Whereas something like the bayberry, southern wax myrtle, or the northern bayberry, they're pretty much coastal plants. They kind of come a little bit into the Piedmont, but not a whole lot. So you might think, oh, I'll plant a big hedge, and I live up in Amherst or live in Roanoke. Like, well, bayberry wax myrtle is really more of a coastal plain plant. Whereas if you were looking for a native rhododendron, the wild pinkster bloom is one that grows pretty much and is found statewide, except for down, you can see down in Southwest Virginia, not so much. Although that one's not an evergreen, that is a deciduous azalea. But this just gives you an idea. When you go to the Plant Atlas, the digital flora of Virginia, it will give you these range maps. And I just find them to be a very useful tool. And then that also, like I said, you might find somebody might see a plant on a list. Don't take for granted that somebody hands you a list and said, these are all native plants, go ahead and plant them, they're okay to use. Check them out, vet them in the flora. For example, one very popular plant that people often like to put in gardens is the purple coneflower, which is really a native to the Midwest. And that particular species, Echinacea purpurea, does not occur naturally in Virginia. So if that matters to you, then I would say don't use an introduced species, use something that actually does occur in Virginia. So we're down to half already. This is the 4th of the 8 essential elements of conservation landscaping, is invasive plants. And what makes a plant invasive? Well, it's a species that has been either intentionally, because of the horticulture trade, or was brought in as an ornamental plant, or was accidentally introduced by human activity into an area where it did not naturally occur, and in turn causes harm to our local natural resources and natural areas, and or economic harm or activity and harm to humans. So these are just some examples: English ivy, porcelain berry, crown vetch. A lot of these species became invasive because of their adaptation. They grew, in other parts of the world, in Asia and Europe, thousands of miles away, where they co-evolved with plant and animal communities and other insect predators and disease pests. So many of these species are generalists. They're able to adapt easily in a new environment. Many of them are able to easily exploit disturbed ground. So remember, we were saying about trying not to disturb the soil too much. I have found just about any time I scratch the surface in my yard anymore with a trowel, I will end up with Japanese stilt grass, because it's everywhere in my landscape. And as soon as I disturb the soil, it gets a foothold and it gets in there. Often these invasive plants have large food reserves, whether that's because of the types of roots they have, or they have rhizomes that break off and can become full-blown plants elsewhere, or they may be produce prolific seeds or have an aggressive growth habit, or maybe some of the above strategies, because again, these occurred somewhere else where they had to survive in those environments, but when they're released here, they're able to take over. Not all non-native plants become invasive. We just don't know which non-natives will be the next invasive 5, 10, 25 years from now. And most of those plants that we're talking about, at least 85% of the woody plants that we have in our landscape that have escaped cultivation, so to speak, are species that were introduced to the ornamental industry because people purchased them and brought them in as ornamental plants. So that includes tree of heaven and butterfly bush and lots of other species. There's tremendous numbers of lists. And one of the things, a lot of people don't realize, and I like to mention this, is, they say, well, it doesn't matter. Autumn olive is a great plant and it's, the birds love it. They eat it. I don't see what the problem is. Well, for one thing, autumn olive has berries at the wrong time of year. Autumn olive has its berries in late summer, early fall, and their berries have a lot of sugar in them. And in the fall, that's when birds need to be putting on fat for the winter. It doesn't have very much fat content in it. So it's kind of like you're giving them sugar or candy. All you have is, Elaeagnus in your landscape. Whereas you look here at the native species, the viburnums, the spice bush, some of the dogwoods, even Virginia creeper, which is a vine, those plants have a much higher percentage of fat in their berries than these other non-native plants like, autumn olive and bittersweet and honeysuckles and multiflora rose, and there's all kinds of species. So keep that in mind. If you're a bird lover and you think you're helping the birds by just letting anything grow willy-nilly in your yard, that's really not the case, because everything that's out there has some sort of food value, just like the food we have in our refrigerator. You open up the refrigerator and there's vegetables that are good for you, and there might be some chocolate cake that's not as good for you. Same thing is true with stuff that's in the landscape. So if you're short on space and you're wondering what to plant, please, by all means, select a native species and not one that's non-native, and especially please do not select one or allow an invasive one to grow in your landscape. If you're wanting to know how to control species, because there's somebody always asks that, well, how do I get rid of this or how do I get rid of that invasive plant? Go to the invasive.org website. You will be able to find both those locations there, of which is this little book called The Invaders of Mid-Atlantic Natural Areas. It's a fabulous book. It is downloadable, and you can just select in there, and it'll give you very specific instructions about every particular plant, whether it's ailanthus, the tree of heaven, or autumn olive, or the non-native wisteria, or periwinkle, as what's on the cover here is an invasive. It'll give you all of those recommendations about how to do it. More locally, I like to put in a plug for Blue Ridge Prism. They're also helping to sponsor this native plant series. They have a lot of excellent fact sheets on their website. And even though they're really primarily focused on the Blue Ridge, a lot of the information that's on there, I think, is very useful. So check them out as well. But do try to familiarize yourself with invasive species. And if you don't know invasive species very well, ask somebody in the Native Plant Society. Go to some of their talks and start learning and find out, because I think once you do, you realize, oh my gosh, half the stuff in my landscape is invasive and I didn't even know it. Because that's how I got started. I didn't know either 15 years ago. How are we doing on time? We're doing good. Okay. Water. Okay. We're back to the 8 essential elements of conservation landscaping. Water quality is huge. All right. We all need clean drinking water, you and I. So does nature. Nature needs clean drinking water. We need streams that are healthy, that have plants around them that are going to keep the soil from eroding into the water. There are rocks and all kinds of organisms that live underneath those rocks in the stream beds. Then there's all the aquatic organisms and fish that rely on those other organisms underneath the rocks. The areas are sanctuaries for birds and other species. So water quality is really important, and a conservation landscape is designed and sustained in a way that helps to conserve and keep the water clean. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, first we need to understand how water moves through the landscape. So in a natural system, water is intercepted when it's rain, whether it's rain or snow. We're just going to use rain as the example. When it falls from the sky, it's slowed down by plants. So trees, shrubs, whatever is there, the canopy, understory, the layer of leaves, anything that's on the ground and covering the ground is going to slow that water down. It's going to allow it time to either soak down into the ground, and maybe just a little teeny bit of it is going to evaporate away. You know, that whole water cycle. But as we go through the different types of landscapes, the more surfaces we have that do not allow water to move down into the ground, the harder it is for water to be sustained there, and it just runs off. So if you're with a natural system, as in the upper left here in this graphic, you maybe only have about 10% of the water runs off after a storm event, because most of it is being infiltrated. That means it's percolating down into the ground. And another 25% of it is going down, really recharging the groundwater aquifer down below. So 50% of it, it's going to go down into the ground when the ground is covered. Whereas the more impervious surfaces you have, the more asphalt and concrete and rooftop and sidewalks that will not allow the water to penetrate the ground, the more runoff you have. And the reason that's an issue is that the more runoff you have, the faster the water will run off, kind of like a garden hose. It's like more and more water coming off of an area in a higher concentrated area really increases the velocity of the water. The water comes off really fast, and it comes off at such a high volume because all that water just fell out of the sky in 2 minutes. It will just shoot down, and it hits the stream down below, whatever below is. So whether it's at the base of a pipe, or it's at the end of your street, or it's the end of your neighborhood, all that water's got to go somewhere. And the less there is on the land to slow the water down and allow it to infiltrate, the greater the impact is going to be downstream. So anything over 10% is going to have some detrimental impact to streams downstream from you. And the more impervious surfaces that you have, the worse it gets. And as you can see, I think you can tell from the one that says 30%, it's going to be very difficult for any life to live in that stream. That stream is degraded even with only 30% impervious cover upstream from it. So sediments are washing off, whether that's in an urban or developed area. Yes, we do have erosion sediment control laws and regulations that govern how to protect these sites during construction. But let's face it, there's always going to be something running off. Nothing is perfect. And lest you think that only urban and suburban areas are places where erosion happens, think again, because there's plenty of erosion going on in rural areas as well, if they're not being protected. In a rural area or have livestock and are wanting to know how to improve your landscape and add plants back that will protect water quality, please contact your local soil and water conservation district, because they have conservation specialists who come out to your land and give you recommendations about what you can do to keep your cows out of the stream or plant more trees and shrubs. And in that upper couple of pictures, that's in my neighborhood. That's just our little subdivision, out here in the boondocks. There's still erosion happening here, even though we have trees and shrubs. These folks in the upper left, they're constantly mowing and compacting the soil to the point where nothing can grow there anymore. And so any water that's coming down off the driveway is eroding down into this ditch, and that soil is still going to end up in the local creek and eventually down a local stream. So sediment is everywhere. And then if you imagine, I mentioned earlier, all these impervious surfaces that aren't taking up water, that means all that rain from that storm is basically flushing all of those toxins and chemicals that are flowing off of the hardscapes, whether that be hydrocarbons or heavy metals or anything that's coming off of our streets, including any fecal coliform that could be from people who don't pick up after their dogs, and other nutrients that could come off of other sources, such as, developments and people adding, fertilizers and things to the ground. So all of these things are going to end up in our waterways if we don't really strive to use plants to protect our waterways. And the way we do that is by looking at the landscape we have. We're not going to unbuild it, but we want to try to put back as many plants as we can and not, pave everything over and put riprap in all the ditches, so that the plants will help our landscapes function more like a natural system. It's not going to be the forest anymore, but we could try to at least help it to function more like a natural system. And so we use plants to do that, not rock and riprap. If you notice here along these different shorelines, now that's not to say, like, if obviously you're in a coastal area, like if you're in Virginia Beach or you're somewhere on a busy river that's got a lot of boat traffic and flooding and coastal coastal flooding and sea level rise, then there might be application for using which is like rip out further out into the water to try to slow it down before it comes up on the land. But in the best practices that I've seen, they might use a combination of rock, but the majority of the benefit of a system like this is that the plants are really doing the lion's share work of slowing the water down, whether that's water coming up onto shore or water flowing off of the land. So these buffers are protecting or providing a little place between the water and the land to slow down anything that's flowing off the land. All of the plants can gradually soak up the nutrients and the sediments that are in the runoff. And basically it filters everything in such a way that the water is cleaned by that process. The plants are cleaning the water, whether it's a farm pond or it's a huge stormwater pond in your neighborhood, it's still the same function. And the same goes for slopes. If you have a slope, why try to mow up and down the steep, slope? Why not allow natural plants to hold and retain the water and slow down any erosion that might happen down off of that slope? So these are just some grasses that are native grasses that are used on a slope. Same thing in a swale. Instead of trying to put rock in there and make the water flow through as fast as possible, which is going to blow out the stream and bring all those nutrients with it, why not have a swale, a little bioswale like this, and either allow the native vegetation to come back, like the cardinal flower, or get it jump started by putting in plugs and allowing some of these natural wet-loving plant communities to grow there and thrive, and in effect perform an ecosystem function while also sustaining life in the landscape. The same can be said for a rain garden, which is, it's not just a hole in the ground, it's not a bathtub, it's a construct that really supports soil that is very permeable. And so it's actually rather sandy soil, very permeable soil, so that water can flow in. It fills it up for maybe a couple days, no more than 48, 72 hours. It's a pool of water. It's not a water, it's a rain garden. And the plants that are in there are adapted for periodic inundation, which means they can handle it to be flooded a little bit, and then they don't mind if it dries out completely in the middle of July or August. So that's another technique. And so is a green roof, which this is. So these are all techniques for trying to intercept water, slow it down, and really improve the health of our water quality throughout all of our stream and river systems. So when we're conserving them, when we want to protect the water, we're using plants that are adapted for our site. We're looking at places where water flows and where we need more plants or less plants. We don't really need to be watering if the plant is adapted, or unless we're just getting the plants established. But if we do have to water, attention to time and not doing it, and when it's 98 degrees in the afternoon sometime, and you got the spigot running out there, and It's all evaporating. And then using these different conservation landscaping best management practices, BMPs, like rain gardens and buffers and impervious. I'm sorry, that should say pervious paving. Pervious meaning you want the water to go through to allow the water to soak down into the ground. Air quality is another one. Conservation landscapes. You think, well, how is doing my landscaping going to affect air quality? Well, that's easy. If you're mowing 3 acres of lawn every week in summer, well, that's a lot of stuff going in the atmosphere. A typical 4 horsepower gasoline powered lawnmower that runs for 1 hour produces as much smog forming hydrocarbons as an average car driving almost 200 miles under average conditions. So we got to reduce the lawn, folks. Imagine this homegrown national park concept, on neighborhoods like this where, gee, this place is really crying out for a shrub bed. Plant some little trees. Let's get rid of using a lawnmower here, and let's plant some trees to clean the air. So trees are very efficient at cleaning the air. One mature tree can remove 26 pounds of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere annually, which is the equivalent of 11,000 miles of car emissions. So if you're wondering, how do I get started? I have this huge yard and I don't want to cut grass anymore. I don't have time to garden. I don't have time to put lots of pretty flowers out there. What am I going to do? Plant a tree. That would be the first step. Plant a tree and maybe a few shrubs around it and you're all set. That's a good start for your habitat. And then stop mowing or mow less. In my own yard, I don't mow more than 2 or 3 times a summer. So I wait till plants get tall. And actually, as a result of doing that, I have some really cool plants that are now colonizing my yard, not the Japanese siltgrass, which is colonizing, but also I've got skullcap and some other ground covers that are taking over the lawn that are providing flowers and are still covering the ground. They're not something I have to mow. So I have less and less to mow, and I mow as little as possible. And there's also the environmental impact of, purchasing the gasoline and just the impacts that we're having on the environment in general. So let's try to minimize that and improve our air quality. And then there's the energy and the chemicals that we use. Obviously, if we're managing to conserve this, all this is collective, not just in our home landscapes, but in our corporate landscapes and in businesses and other places in our communities. If we're looking at that, then we're going to be looking at much more sustainable and healthy landscapes. You can see from this hedgerow here, there is no hedgerow anymore. This person has very routinely come in and sprayed quite regularly. This is in my own neighborhood. I've had a hard time just trying to have a conversation with this person. But in order for this to look completely devoid of life, it takes a lot of chemical to do that. And that may not be what's best for the trees and for the birds and for the other life around us. So it's a challenge. We have a cultural bias now to think that this is normative. And this is something that's going to be hard for us to overcome. So, a natural hedgerow could look like this. And actually, 50 years ago, they did look like this. We didn't have such clean landscapes. In fact, people have gotten cleaner, I think, as the decades have gone by, which is a paradox to me because we seem to know more about the environment now. But the best way to try to minimize the amount of energy and chemicals that you use is really to choose native species that are adapted for your site. And the more diversity you have in the landscape, the less pest problems you're going to have because everything's interdependent. You've got the predators out there, you've got the wasps eating the insects that would be eating your plants. So that whole process is called integrated management, where escape by basically using those natural processes to sustain and keep insect populations in check, and only using chemicals when absolutely needed, and of course following the label. So my last part of this is my 8th of the 8 essential elements of conservation landscaping. the way, and the reason I ordered them this way, because I said that they're not ordered this way in the book by the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, is because my feeling is if you do all those other things we talked about, if you design with a systems approach with nature in mind, if you design using the natural plant community as your palette or your reference, if you use native species and try to avoid using non-natives, if you try to control and take out invasive species, if you do all these things and you're protecting water with your landscape, then you will be providing wildlife habitat. It just goes together. It's not really hard to do. When I first moved into my home 20 years ago, there was nothing here aside from some large pine trees. There was one big shrub out in the yard and everything else was lawn, and there was nothing here. And a lot of the pictures that you'll see in this last part of the presentation are pictures that I've taken either around my home or in my neighborhood. As soon as I started planting things and also letting plants come in, for example, just as an example, next to the house where it was some moisture, I didn't mow. I didn't keep mowing and mowing. And I just wanted to see, well, I wonder what will come up here if I don't mow every time. And gradually the grass died and all these ferns came in, natural ferns came in. And then as soon as the ferns came in, I started to see toads. I'm like, oh, there's little toads here now because now they have a place to live where they couldn't live before. And it was just amazing. If you just give nature a chance, if you just allow nature a little bit of wiggle room and just share your space, it's really, I think, going to be very rewarding to you because then you start to see all kinds of things you never even realized were in your neighborhood. It comes down to layers, just like a layered cake. If you like cake, I love cake. So layers to me, love that frosting in the middle. There's got to be layers. In the landscape, the more layers you have, the more diversity you're going to have. Remember, we said biodiversity is key to conservation. If you have these layers, you're going to have all the different organisms, the suite of organisms, whether those be birds or mammals or amphibians or reptiles or insects or spiders. Those are all going to be in here in the places where they need to occupy their own habitat or there are wonderful books out there about how to do this. I mentioned one earlier, the one that Doug Tallamy and Rick Dark wrote about the living landscape. This one here by Claudia West and Thomas Rayner, I highly recommend. Planting in a Post-Wild World. I hope they'll forgive me for using this graphic, but I just wanted you to see that this is the treat that you're in for if you get this book, because they not only have deconstructed the landscape from a naturalistic viewpoint about how to layer the landscape, they've done it from a design perspective. This is how a landscape designer can actually approach the landscape and look at the ground cover, the middle layer, and the other structural layer. They're calling a structural layer with shrubs and trees. And by doing this, you're putting back habitat. So it really is a wonderful model for how to go about designing your landscape. I highly recommend it. So you could pick a landscape. Everybody has a different style. You can pick the style that suits you best, whatever you like, in your landscape. It's your property, or even if you're renting, you can make suggestions to the person who owns the property. How do we put back some of these elements that we've learned about? And in so doing, you can see here, everything on the ground here is covered. There is no brown mulch. There should be no brown mulch visible. If you see a landscape where you see like little meatball bushes and there's all this brown mulch around it, that really is not a diverse landscape. It's a good start, but it's not a diverse landscape. Here in this picture, you can see there's a lot of diversity in this landscape. There's ground covers, there's perennials, and I don't know if these are all native. Maybe some of them are not. If you have a couple of ornamentals, your mother's favorite hosta or something, yeah, go ahead, put it in there. But if the predominant plant in your landscape are natives, that's really the key. If it's a predominance of natives, that's really going to sustain nature. And you can see there's shrubs and there's trees. You've got the canopy here, you've got the understory. So I wanted to just real quickly go through these different layers I prefer not to call the leaf layer leaf litter, because to me, litter means trash. And to me, leaves are gold. They are not trash. Leaves are, gosh, they're just like, think of them as vitamins. It's like all the vitamins from the trees are in the leaves. And you don't want to bag up all that good stuff and throw it away. And then you go out there and buy some brown bag of mulch from a box store and stick it in the landscape. You're better off using those. You could leave them intact and whole on the ground. That would be the best bet, because that's going to support all these little insect and organisms that are going to do the work for you. They're the chewers and the shredders and the decomposers. All these little insects are in there chewing and eating away, breaking those leaves down into tiny pieces and basically recycling those nutrients back into the soil. But, I understand if you're in a very tiny lot, or you're in a townhouse and you have a huge tree, like a mountain of leaves, you can't possibly keep all those leaves, then maybe shred them a little bit with your lawnmower, break them up and break them down a little bit to get them in, a smaller pile. That could be effective too. But if you don't have to do that, just leave them whole. Because look at the variety of species that are using, and this is just a little sampler of some of the species that would be in there. You've got the lizards are eating the insects, and then you've got snakes that are coming in and eat the lizards and the insects, and you've got the little birds that are foraging, and the toads that are down there. It's just tons of ecosystem services are happening right down here at the leaf layer, or the mulch layer, or the soil layer. And by extension, that includes ground cover. So in my own yard, as I mentioned, I've allowed a lot of ferns to come back. You can see I don't really have turf grass. I don't know what this is. It's just I have a lot of plantains that came in. Many of these are not native, but they're not too aggressive. But I don't have turf grass, but I have had plenty of visitors in my yard, such as the box turtle that comes and wanders through from time to time. And in the back, where I have a cooler, moisture site, I've tried to encourage, wild ginger to grow. I've planted some turtle heads and Tradescantias and the woodland flock. And interesting, you think like, what do these plants really do for wildlife other than provide cover? They're providing all kinds of services, and so are the insects and the organisms that use them. For example, this little patch of ginger down here happens to be next to my potting table. And I noticed this last year, there were some ginger plants growing out of my mulch bag, my little bag of a little bit of mulch that I had bought. And you think, well, how did that happen? I didn't plant ginger in there. Well, of course not. I didn't do that, but the ants did that. Ants are responsible for up to like 25% of seed dispersal in woodland settings. I'm surrounded by woodland. And the ginger plant is adapted to ants. The ginger seed has these little fatty appendages on it. They're called eliosomes. They have like a lipid in them. It's a fatty deposit inside around the seeds. And the ant wants to eat the fat because they need food for the winter, just like everything else. And so they take the seed and they go and take it into their nest. This must mean there's probably an ant nest inside this bag. And they eat the little eliosomes, the little fatty deposits, and they throw the seed away like, oh, I don't need that. But the seed is intact. They haven't injured the seed. And now the seed has been planted by the ant. And so now the seed can grow and new ginger plants can grow. So if you plant it, they will come. You don't have to go find or buy anything, any organisms, or you don't have to buy things. You don't have to buy nature. Nature will come if you give them the habitat that they need. The herbaceous layer is probably the prettiest layer that we as humans focus on, because of course it's all about us. We want everything to look really pretty. And, so we're always into color and color schemes and, what's in my landscape. These are the plants that are not woody, the herbaceous plants. And it includes all of the grasses, the flowering plants, whether they're perennial or annual. Most plants are perennial, but there are many that are biannual, and provides cover for all the insects and birds and things that can live in there. So again, notice how the only brown place in this garden is the walkway. There is nothing to mow, and you don't see any brown mulch anywhere. This is completely covered. To me, this is a ground cover. A ground cover does not have to be only 1 or 2 inches tall. I just threw this one in here because I just love this senna plant. I don't know why I added this one. I just thought it was really cool. Look at the flower on that. Just think of the insects that are adapted for this. It's amazing. I just had to include it. But the powerhouse plants, and this is where Talmy talks about productivity. So the oak tree is very productive, but in the herbaceous layer, there are also some plants that are fairly productive, at least as far as providing nectar and pollen for bees, butterflies, wasps, flies, beetles, and other organisms that need nectar and pollen. And so I've grouped them here by genus. Okay, so each one of these genuses or genera has many different species in them. So the coneflowers, the bee balms, the asters, the goldenrods, the foxes, the milkweeds, the mints, mountain mint and different kinds of mints. Each one of these has many different species in them. And so remember when I mentioned the Flora of Virginia has the digital atlas, you can type in the genus name Helianthus or Asclepius or Phlox or Solidago or Symphytrichum or Pycnanthemum and find out which of those species actually occurs in my county that I should buy. That would be a good approach if you don't already have a list from someplace else. And let's remember vines are also, to me, part of that. To me, it's part of that lower perennial landscape. I think of these as part of that herbaceous layer. So, trumpet vine, passion vine, American wisteria. These are some native vines. These need large trellises. They're very aggressive and can take over. So, you wouldn't put this in a little tiny garden, but if you have lots of space and a big fence or a trellis or an arbor or something, these are some great choices. I myself really enjoy the trumpet honeysuckle on the side of my house. And I have observed hummingbird clearwing moths. There's the snowberry and the hummingbird clearwing, and the moth uses the flowers. Obviously, they're looking for nectar as an adult, but the caterpillar that you see here, they will use Lonicera as one of the host plants. So, you're not going to have this caterpillar in your yard if you don't have this type of native plant. And so just wrapping it up here, timing is important. If you're planting and installing native species, think about what's going to be out there blooming in the spring and all through the summer and the fall and into very late season up until the first frost. You can really extend the value of your habitat throughout the year. And speaking of the end of the year, we're coming to the time of year when it's really important not to clean up your garden. I know it's tempting to get in there and cut all those dead stems off and just clean it up. But remember, the habitat is supporting all of these insects and spiders and bees. They've either tunneled inside the stems of these plants, or they've laid their eggs in these plants or on the plants. So if you go in November and cut it all down, you've basically just taken out all the habitat that you had that was supposed to sustain wildlife over winter. So leave the dead plants standing and the dead stems. I think they provide visual structure. To me, it provides something to look at in the landscape, especially when it snows. It's kind of pretty to see something out there instead of just flat ground. And I would recommend, if possible, to leave those dead plants standing until April. And many of you are probably thinking, are you kidding? She's out of her mind. I'm not leaving that stuff in there after February, because everybody wants to go in the first warm day in February or March and cut everything down. So I'll just say, if you have to do it, if you have to cut things in February or March, cut the stalks, leave them standing upright somewhere in the woods or somewhere behind your fence or something. So at least the organisms that overwintered in those stalks can still emerge in the spring, which might not be until April or May. Shrub layer is critical for bird habitat, nesting, food, cover for all sorts of organisms. And then, of course, the canopy layer overhead. I just wanted to mention oaks one more time because Doug Tallamy really talks about productivity. Some plants are more productive than others. If you go to National Forest, National Park, Homegrown National Park website, there's all kinds of articles and videos on there, and you could read his book about oaks too. But they support by far many, many species of Lepidoptera, which are butterflies and moths, but lots of other organisms too. And the canopy is the overhead, and it's going to be providing lots of nesting structure and mast like oak, acorns and seeds. And then in wintertime, I love the eastern red cedar. This is a fabulous habitat, especially if you can plant it in hedgerows or in thickets. The bluebirds, robins in spring, especially when the robins come back, but the bluebirds that overwinter will use these areas if you make them available. And then when it snows, it also provides cover for all kinds of sparrows and other birds, cardinals and things to hide and get some protection from the wind and the cold. And as a corollary, if you leave dead trees standing when you can, or leave the branches and create brush piles on the ground, that will also provide cover and also structural components for insects, and then the birds that eat the insects, such as woodpeckers and other species. Water goes without saying. As I mentioned earlier, we all need water. So a water feature, if you can get one in the landscape, bird bath is nice, but water features in something in the ground is really going to sustain frogs and salamanders. Not a fish pond, because fish will eat those little guys. But in my own yard, I've used just a little bathtub liner to make a little frog pond. And I do have all kinds of tree frogs, and I've gotten all kinds of the spotted salamander and different salamander species have laid their eggs in my little tiny pond. If your budget can sustain it, heck, put in a huge water garden with a pump and a filter and all these different plants. That's fabulous too, especially if you're in a landscape that doesn't have a water source. So these last little resources here, one more plug for the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council. If you're wondering, well, who do I hire who really knows how to do these things? I want to make sure I get somebody who understands conservation landscaping, who actually knows how to use native plants, or at least understands them as a system. I recommend you check out the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Program. That is a credentialed program where folks have attended the class, they've taken an exam and proved their proficiency at different levels. There's level 1 and level 2. And if you go to cblpro.org, you can type in your zip code and zoom out to 50 miles or 20 miles, whatever, and see who's in your area, who's a certified Chesapeake Bay landscape professional. That would be somebody, that's where I would start if I was going to recommend how do you hire somebody. These are 2 articles that I wrote about Habitat for Wildlife. Habitat at Home booklet is a short one with a little plant list. The Habitat Gardening for Wildlife article is actually the 30 plus page chapter 13 of the Master Gardener Handbook. So if you want to really dive deep into Habitat for Wildlife, those resources are available there at Department of Wildlife Resources. So in summary, I think this kind of goes without saying, but I just wanted to bring it all home, is that this is what nature does, how nature works. And if we work with nature, we can be partners in the landscape. We can work together. Nature wants to fill in bare spaces, so let's keep the ground covered and allow native species to come in, try to not to disturb the soil too much. We know that plants grow in communities, not like little single lollipop plants. So let's grow in layers. Let's select species in groupings and clusters, and try to select species that would be found and occurring together in a natural community. Let's remember that soil building is an ongoing process. Nature is constantly breaking things down and building things up. So let's use what we have in our landscape, organic materials and fallen leaves, as an asset. And finally, let's never forget that the landscape is a living system. It's a living organism, and we are part of that life. And if we allow for those surprises and those living systems to take hold, I think that you will really be inspired. And I hope that when we started, you thought of a beautiful place in nature. Maybe you thought of a place that was far away. I think a lot of people, when I invite them to imagine a place in nature somewhere on the earth, they think of the wilderness, or they think of the mountains or the beach or someplace far away from where they live. But if you imagine that you can do this around your own home, this little tree frog here, I found this little guy just a couple weeks ago, and I took his picture, and he's just looking at me. He's looking at us, folks. These little guys are counting on us. He's counting on me. He's got his eye on me. He's like, I'm watching you. Let's get it right. Let's bring the life back. And I wish you well in the landscape. I hope you have really a wonderful time in your landscape. Good luck.
Thank you, Carol. I think we are very inspired and ready to be
Sorry, got emotional.
Yeah, as well you should, as well we all should be. It's wonderful work that really pays off, and you've given us so many ideas about how to do that, and a vision of what we can accomplish. So thank you so much. For anyone who has more questions, please add them to the Q&A panel. And we'll turn it over to Beth to feed you some questions when you're ready.
I'm ready. I'm good to go. I'm sorry it took so long, but I just was a lot to cover, and I just wanted you all to have the big picture view. So
that's great, Carol. Thank you so much. Carol, how are you feeling? Like how long do you want to go on for? Because it's already 8 o'clock. So I just want to check in with you.
Well, I think you said we have till at least 8:15, right?
Yeah. And we can go longer.
I can go past that. Yeah, if folks want to. I'm trying to find my grid. There you are. I can't really see you. Now I can see you. Okay.
Yeah, I think your PowerPoint is still on. You're still sharing your screen, perhaps. Well, we'll go ahead and get started with the first question. Carol. There you are. I thought I lost you for a minute. So we had a lot of questions about some of the resources.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Okay. I don't know what happened. I think I'm having trouble with it.
Yeah, if you need to, Carol, you can turn your video off to help with the audio. But we really do like to see you. Okay, Carol, can you hear me now? No, you're muted.
Okay, you got me now?
Yeah.
I don't know. Okay, I don't know why it's doing that. It's something I made sure my PowerPoint was off. So something was happening where it was kicking me out of Zoom.
That's weird. Well, we'll keep you hanging in there as long as we can. So we had quite a few questions about some of the resources you shared with us this evening. And I wanted to ask you if you could expand upon some of that. And some were just some simple questions, and some were a little bit more background would be appreciated. But the first one was about, someone was asking if there's a source that gives information on what eats each of our native trees, in particular the caterpillars. And so one suggestion was Doug Tallamy's Bringing Nature Home, but do you have some other favorite resources to share that really drills down on like what particular lepidopteran might eat a particular tree species?
Yes, or at least for the butterflies, not as much as for the moths. In fact, if I don't have the book handy here. So Bob Blakeney, Blakney, Bob Blakeney wrote a book on butterflies of the mid-Atlantic. And in that book, he has all the different butterfly species, and every entry, it'll tell you what their host plant is and what they eat. And I find that to be a really very valuable resource.
Great, thank you. And oaks, you mentioned that oaks support over 500 species of lepidopterans, so those are definitely your big heavy hitters. Another resource that you mentioned, and it's one of my favorite ones, it's from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Native Plants for Wildlife Habitat and Conservation Landscaping. Is this, do you know if this is still available in print?
I don't know if it's in print. I believe you can purchase them online, maybe through Amazon. At one point, every 3 or 4 years, the Fish and Wildlife Service will put out an email to lots of organizations if they want to do a print job. And then if they get hundreds printed, then it brings the cost down. So there's always a lot of people interested in that. So maybe the Plant Virginia Natives or the Native Plant Marketing Partnership or even the Native Plant Society might be interested in getting a quantity of those and making them available to the public, because I find them very useful, even though it's for the whole mid-Atlantic. It has a lot of little thumbnail pictures and tells you all the growing requirements. And it does have a column in there that tells you that which ones are really good for supporting pollinators.
Yeah, like I said, I like that resource as well. And then a final question about some of the resources you provided. You mentioned the Natural Communities of Virginia on DCR's Natural Heritage website. And can you talk about how you use this tool and maybe some tips on for someone who wants to learn more about how to figure out what natural community is in their backyard, and maybe how to use that guide as a tool for planning their conservation landscaping?
As I recall, and correct me if I'm wrong, but as I recall, Trista Emmerich did a talk in this series, and she spent several slides showing how to use that natural community book.
Yes. Okay.
And so what I was trying to mention in my talk was, when you get in that book, basically you find the plant community that you're in, and then there are these places you can click, or clickable links, where you click on the code and it will take you through that process. It's not something I can describe here without really showing you.
Yeah.
But as I recall, I'm pretty sure Trista Emmerich had covered that in her talk. And I don't remember which one that was in the series. But as far as really for me personally, when you say, how do I use it? I'm not designing other people's landscapes. I'm like an advisor. I will give people information, or I'll share some ideas and walk a property with them, but not like homeowners. I just do that mostly with volunteer groups. But what I try to do is really look at the community in your neighborhood. So now that depends on where you live, and but even if you're in Chesterfield County, somewhere in Richmond, or you're in an urban area, if you're able to find an area where plants are not being cut or not being mowed, take a look at what's growing in those waste spaces, or waste spaces as people call them. Sometimes it might be next to the road if they're not mowing the road. You might find different types of coneflowers, or coreopsis, or asters, milkweeds, things growing there. Take a look at what you can find that's native, and that will inform your choice. So you can see, oh, these plants are growing here. Well, they ought to grow okay in my yard too, because I'm in the same area. That's one approach, is to just look at what's growing around you.
That's an excellent suggestion. Take inspiration from that local park, or walk along the street. So moving into from those resources and thinking about how to figure out what you have in terms of your natural community, or what plants you need. We have a couple of people that have asked about, they have some lawn, and one person has challenges with ailanthus in their lawn, and they're finding that they have to mow the lawn, but they want to convert to conservation landscaping. And so they're in a bit of a quandary with the constant inundation of that invasive tree, and not sure what to do. So can you talk about how, when you're thinking about conservation landscaping, how to maybe plan for success and dealing with some of these invasive plants up front when you're thinking about this?
Yeah, well, just as we mentioned, looking in your neighborhood for what natives are growing there, take a look in your neighborhood at what invasives you find. And clearly this person's already found ailanthus. In my own neighborhood, I actually have seen a couple of them growing down the street. And so my goal this fall, as soon as I have an opportunity, is to go down when nobody's looking and kill those 2 trees. Because once they get into the neighborhood, they're here. So yes, you want to be mindful of what's around you. So if your neighbor has invasive plants, you just are going to have to know that those plants are always going to keep trying to colonize into your property. You're never going to really get away from that, especially if you're surrounded by this pressure of a lot of invasives in the landscape around you. So that's not to discourage you, but that's just to say the only antidote to that is to knock them back. And so for ailanthus, my understanding is the best time to hack and squirt them. Well, it could be in the fall or in the spring, but in the fall, they're sucking down all the nutrients from their leaves down into their roots, and that could be one way to kill them. So you want to kill the roots. You definitely don't want to cut ailanthus because it just makes more stump sprouts. You're actually helping it to grow. And again, you've got resources at Blue Ridge Prism, and there's lots of invasive.org references. But I would just say, as you're knocking those back, be ready to plant something else in its place. So if you're wanting to replace lawn with some other small trees or shrubs, then you could add maybe redbud or dogwood or some viburnums or an oak tree. I don't know how much space you have, until eventually those species are able to maybe take hold and then maybe shade out some of the invasives, and then you kind of flip flop the dynamic, the paradigm. That's possible.
Mm-hmm. And that's the challenge of working in areas like especially suburban yards where you might have a lot of invasive plants that are growing that have escaped cultivation, and I fight them in my personal yard. I have English ivy everywhere, and I'm trying to find solutions to replace it, and it's just so much. And then the constant influx of invasives, the birds moving plants around and seeds around. So I was really trying to get at some of the, thinking about maintenance and planning for that and expecting that.
That's part of your plan. In fact, I have the same issue with English ivy, but I have found that the more I rip out, gradually the Virginia creeper has started to gradually take over. Yeah, it takes time. It does. But
yeah, I've been trying to encourage the Virginia creeper and the trumpet honeysuckle, and so the coral honeysuckle. So yeah. Well, okay. So we have another related question, and this really speaks to some of the water quality things that you talked about, and erosion. So this person they've begun developing a corner of their property, and they're working in the yard, but they have a grassy ditch. So, I mean, obviously there's going to be water moving through it. And it sounds like they're concerned about erosion and how to tackle that. Do they need to remove the grass? Do they add plants to it? What are some strategies to kind of prevent erosion, but to incorporate more native plants in areas like that?
Yeah, so but it often depends on the steepness of the slope. It depends on how much water is shooting through there, the velocity of the water, the volume of the water. So without really knowing what it looks like, it's kind of hard to say. But in general, one thing I would say is I wouldn't rip out the grass right away. I wouldn't rip out the grass and then try to plant something while this rain is coming. So one approach could be, again, this is on a homeowner scale, not on a huge subdivision with 5 acres of water running through it, but in a small application, you might try making little circles in the grass. So if you have a grass swale, maybe make a circle that's 3-4 feet wide. Try using some native grasses or native shrubs, and that would, you would look at those lists to see which ones prefer some drainage conditions, and kind of get some things colonized, get some things started, get 3 or 4 things in there. And then once those have started to grow, then try taking out a little bit more grass and do a little bit, so that make like these little islands in effect. And that's assuming it's okay for you to be able to weed eat or get around them because you have the grass growing in the meantime. But gradually, as you put in those other plants and they start to shade out the grass or the turf below, the turf will gradually die out and you will have replaced it with the other species. So, because I know what sometimes happens is people try to rip out all the grass and then they put in these little itty bitty plants and then the plants get washed out and then they have a real mess because like, oh my gosh, I should have just left the grass in there because, the sod is holding it temporarily. So it's a transitional process, but it really depends.
Yeah. And they asked specifically if they needed to keep it grassy or is it okay to add more natives? And I think in your answer, it's absolutely okay to add more natives.
Absolutely add more natives.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you might even try replacing some of the grass with native ground covers that like swales, like maybe the Pennsylvania sedge, if it's not out in the full sun. But it's hard to recommend plants because that really depends on the amount of sunlight where you are, again, so I don't really want to recommend specific species.
That's fine. Yeah. Just the strategies is very helpful. Okay. Let's see. We have so many questions and I'm just trying to navigate all of them. And so we talked about the spring cleanup, the importance of leaving plants in place through the winter to protect pollinators and other. So we have a few questions about that. And someone asked, they have a large property and it can be overwhelming to do all of the winter cleanup at once, like in May. So they're asking if there are certain plants that you could cut back earlier just to maybe stretch the task out over a longer period of time. But that, maintaining a large property can be overwhelming. So maybe you could answer that question and think about how you might approach caring for a larger property so it's not overwhelming.
Well, sequencing, I guess, can be very valuable. I typically in the fall, I try to stake plants to keep them from falling over so they don't look too messy in spring. I guess it depends on what you have growing there. If you have like asters and I'm trying to think what else people might have, goldenrods and pie weeds. I don't know what you're growing in your yard, but some of those, many of them will colonize. They have like these little root balls. So they've got the basal leaves that stay over winter. For example, the penstemon plant is one that I'm thinking of, the Packera plant. A lot of these species will have these little basal roots that are intact. And I usually leave the dead stem so I can make sure I can find those plants growing in the spring. I think it just depends. I mean, if you have a huge landscape, I guess I would start with some of the perennials and then, like I said, stack those stalks someplace, do it a little bit at a time, maybe in late February, early March. And then if you have to prune, certain shrubs and trees are better pruned in the fall than in the spring and vice versa. It depends on the species. So I would stage it, but personally, I do very little pruning and cutting. This is just an ethic. So I guess I would invite everyone, not just the person who asked the question, but I would invite everyone to think about, can I let a few things go? Is it okay to let this bed just stay like it is? And a technique you could use could be to maybe plant certain things in front of it that provides a screen, because those are the things that are going to bloom sooner in the spring or fill in and green up more quickly. And maybe some of that brown stuff that's not ready to be cut yet would be behind it and you wouldn't see it. You can maybe, change some things around a little bit. So I guess I would just encourage folks not to be too worried about how clean it looks. Again, having that cue to care, making it clear to your neighbors, I am sustaining and I'm maintaining my yard. I'm not just letting it go, can be very important in some areas, because some subdivisions, they won't let you grow anything more than 12 inches tall. And so that can be a challenge. So maybe having a border around things where you have the turf grass around the planted bed, keep that nice and clean and tidy and mowed, so that the other ones are, the plants that are still standing are kind of like set back and not right on the edge of the curb or something, can be a way to do it too. But staging the maintenance is just it can be very challenging if you have a huge landscape. And really one of the ways I'm trying to get away from that myself in my own landscape is as plants die, as some of the flowers die, I'm just trying to allow the shrubs to grow. I can't plant more shrubs because I have a drain field, but if it's getting too difficult to maintain your landscape, just chill and just have more shrubs and don't have to have so many, flowers all over the place, because that is a lot more work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I really challenge people to reframe there, and this isn't directed at this person who asked the question, but just in general, when we get questions like this, I challenge people to reframe what they consider beautiful, and knowing that something is living and overwintering and is thriving in that dead hollow stem, that is beautiful to me, and it continues the nature cycle and finding beauty.
You're gonna make me cry again.
I know, I cry all the time, Carol, when I think about this stuff. So
I think of the animals are sleeping. They're sleeping in the winter.
Yeah, exactly.
Resting.
So great answer. Thank you so much, Carol. And we had another question about this person, and this is kind of funny. They want to keep their leaves in their yard, but they blow up against the house. Do you have any suggestions on maybe how they can keep their leaves where they want them to be?
Yeah, well, in my own yard, I know that the wind can blow them in places you don't want them. So I do use a rake. I don't use a leaf blower because I'm not into using gasoline powered equipment when I could get some exercise using my rake. I just keep raking them into a pile, and I use a lot of it in my compost pile because I do vegetable gardening too. And so I'm using those leaves and I keep putting them in the compost pile. And also, I didn't mention this in the talk, but I know sometimes if you keep too much of the leaf matter next to your house, or pine needles or whatever you've got growing around your house, you don't want a lot of that stuff built up against your foundation, because it can attract, and remember, this is habitat, so you can attract animals closer to the house. And you also don't want a fire hazard right next to your porch or something where you have lots of dead leaves next to the porch or something. So keeping those things away from the building can be really important. But try using those leaves if you can around other trees and shrubs in the area. Just in effect, moving them back and forth. I just move things around a lot. I'm constantly moving leaves around. I will say, some years ago, I'd never even got around to raking the little driveway behind my house, because the driveway, I don't have to really drive back there. And I was really busy and never got to rake it. And I left the leaves there on the gravel. And that winter, I had quail in my backyard. I was looking out the kitchen window and I'm like, what are those little brown blobs out there? And I got my binoculars out and they were quail. And the only reason they were there is because the leaves were still there. And they were there, it was like January or February, and they were poking around trying to find some little bugs or something. So you never know what you might find.
Yeah, it definitely. You mentioned allow for surprises, and when you get little treats from nature like that, those are really pleasant surprises and rewards for changing some of your habits. Just maybe a couple more questions, Carol.
Sure, I'm game.
Okay. Let's see. Let me.
And I'm sure you had a lot. I apologize to folks that we can't really possibly cover them all.
I know. Yeah.
People?
so many questions. We never get to them all. So I just want to touch on climate change and how do you see climate change playing into what is native and what will grow into our area? Or maybe to think about that, how can we prepare our gardens and conservation landscapes for climate change?
Right. Well, I think it's presumptive of us to think that we can control climate change by selecting plants, but rather nature is going to select itself for us.
Mhm.
But as far as climate change goes, there's really two impacts that I'll just mention. One is phenology, and that is the timing of the return of insects when they emerge and the return of the birds when they're migrating. As the climate changes or the temperature warms up, and we've already observed this in many places. And I think there's been plenty of articles written about this where, if things are emerging too soon and the food source isn't there when the birds come back, or vice versa, that can have an impact. So climate change does impact those insect populations and plant communities as well. There's also evidence that ranges may gradually change. So, what plant, I recently saw a talk, I don't know who gave that talk, but they were showing range maps were projected like 50 years into the future, to where the flowering dogwood tree will be relegated to more upper elevation parts of the state, to higher elevations and to the rest of the state. And that bald cypress, which we are typically really at the northernmost edge of its range now, may be statewide. So there's the range. And then also climate change is affecting the temperature changes is this huge dynamic. I mean, I'm oversimplifying this, but invasive plants are also linked to climate change because they seem to be getting an even better jump start with temperature warming, or they don't die back in the winter because now the winter isn't as cold as it used to be. And so where we used to be able to rely on cold weather to kill some invasive plants in our landscape, now they're here year round. So, I don't know if that really answers the question, but certainly it does have an impact. And, that's why they're having a climate accord right now internationally to discuss these bigger overarching issues, which I don't know that we can solve all of them in our tiny little landscapes. I think it really has more to do with policy and regulation, to address true climate issues. If you really want to reduce carbon emissions, it's, yes, we can plant trees in our own yards and in our faith communities and around our schools and our shopping centers and business parks. But at some level, there does need to be some political will to, take it 2 or 3 more steps higher than that, to make sure that we're not, we think we're doing well. Oh, we're just planting trees and that'll be fine. That might just be greenwashing to some folks, which may not really be solving the problem 100 years from now. So that's a pretty huge issue.
Yeah. Well, thanks for touching on that. And then I think our final question, somebody asked if you could list your 8 essential principles in short. Can you do that off the top of your head, or do I need to tell them?
Sure.
This book?
I actually, I could, so you don't, if you don't want to get the, so it's the Conservation Landscaping Guidelines from the Chesapeake Conservation Landscape Council.
Yeah.
And the order that I did them in my program, I guess I should read them in the order that they are in the book. So it's designed to benefit the environment efficiently and aesthetically for human use, and controls invasive plants, provides habitat for wildlife, promotes healthy air quality, conserves and cleans water, promotes healthy soils, and is managed to conserve energy, reduce waste, and eliminate or minimize the use of pesticides and fertilizers.
Thank you. Well, and so we'll make that our last question. And so many wonderful comments and thank yous from our audience this evening, Carol. And Gary says, congratulations on your retirement. We will miss you. So
Oh, well,
I hope,
thanks.
I hope you know who Gary is. So, and so
Well,
with
you know,
that, go ahead.
if you do me a favor and if you would save the chat box for me,
Yeah,
maybe you could send that to me in a file later. I can see other folks' comments because I'd be real curious. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you all, everybody. I really
yeah.
wish you all well and happy planting and good luck.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Carol.
you. Thank you. Thank you, Carol. Yay. Great. Again, really great cap to the series. I just want to share some final notes with you all. Share my screen here. I just want to thank everyone who's left in the line and everyone who's listening to this recording and participated in this series. I really want to thank you ever so much for joining us and again for participating in this series. We all of us, all of the partners who've been involved in planning this and conducting this, we ourselves have learned so much along the way with you from all of our speakers. In addition to sharing the recordings of most of the webinars on plantvirginianatives.org, we will be revisiting the hundreds of questions that have been raised during the series to create some FAQs that we'll post on the website, and that'll happen over the next few months. But in the meantime, if you have any questions or a follow-up request, please don't hesitate to email me at virginia.whitmer@deq.virginia.gov. You'll see my website up here on the screen. Please share the website. Again, please share the recordings and encourage your neighbors and your family and your friends and everyone you meet. When people come to my door to sell me something, I sell them native plants. People I work with and I interact with in other organizations and community groups. I tell them all about what I do and I'm handing out copies of the guide. So, please, we need your help in spreading the message that every yard makes a difference. And I wanted to say, Carol, you're not the only one who's cried recently. I gave a presentation the other day, and when I was talking about the loss of our bird populations, I started crying too. It's going to take everyone, and I have so much work to do in my own yard. See, even I'm going to start. Anyhow, without further ado, I'm going to end before we all start bawling. We really, truly, we're just so pleased that you all joined us. And so I just want to say good night and happy Virginia native planting. Thank you all.
Yeah, and send us your success stories. Send your success stories in about places that you've planted. That would be cool.